Hi, Dr. Bresson. Welcome to the Existential Neuron podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we kickstart our conversation, would you like to give a brief introduction about you to our listeners?
Sure. My name is Federica Bressan. I'm speaking to you from Italy right now. And I have been an academic researcher for the past decade, since 2009, so a little over a decade. And my background is in technology and culture, cultural heritage specifically. So I've always worked with computer science applications in the field of culture, preservation, and in particular, sound recordings.
That's good to know that. It's interesting to see this intersection between humanities and computers because I think most of my audience, or maybe like the people who listen to this, or maybe even my interviews are mostly like STEM focused. So I think that having this perspective on culture and computer science combined would be interesting to have. So I would like to ask you a few general questions to kickstart. How do you think the field in which you researched was affected by the COVID pandemic? Like, how do you see the cultural changes in COVID, like in this COVID era?
That's a very good question. And the first two things that come to mind is, first of all, how the life of researchers has been affected by COVID. Mine has for sure. And, jokes aside, the field, in a way, is too early to say. If you asked some cultural institution or the museums that had to shut down, they could already tell you how this affected them. But in research, the answer on the research field per se, I think it's really early. That if you ask different researchers, they have been personally impacted because some projects had to come to a halt because they probably needed to go and collect some data on the field and they couldn't go anymore. Me personally, I have been affected because I was working at Stony Brook University in New York from January 2020 until the end of March when I was repatriated and I couldn't complete my research because it didn't feel safe. Nobody knew what was going to happen then. Trust me that I would never have believed that over a year later we would be still in this situation. But so my personal research came to a stop last year. And I did not mention in my introduction because you wanted to focus on my academic activity, but I am somehow transitioning now to a career in science communication. So a couple of these roadblocks that I encountered did nothing but encourage me more to shift to something that I can perfectly do during this current pandemic, which is video interviews, a little bit of what you're doing now, as opposed to research per se.
Got it. So it's interesting that you brought up you think to switch to a career of scientific communication because I think especially like after COVID, a lot of people were looking forward to like what scientific journalists or medical journalists have to say. So has there been like a personal like incident or something that made you say, hey, besides the pandemic, obviously, that you want to specifically explore like scientific publication or like scientific journalism?
I wouldn't say something negative or an accident or something that made me move away from research. I loved doing research, but I also loved communication very much. In fact, before I did my PhD, I also worked as a journalist for a while. And I was a musician, I was a performer, so I really, really loved research, but I'm this outgoing, communicative person. And I really, well, what happened was not something negative, was something positive actually, which is that during Marie Curie grant that I was working on in Belgium, I got some research funds on my own. Yeah, that's not something that every researcher has. And so that gave me some freedom and some time to choose. Actually, outreach activities were part of what I was required to do. And I started traveling a bit more just because I could. And it turned out to be awesome for my personal network and for just learning unexpected things. Like, it's really good to travel, but in normal times, you don't travel unless you have a reason to go there. And sometimes I also traveled without a reason, or I found a reason to go. And so I started giving lectures, because that's what you normally ask to do when you visit another group, to audiences that were not always specifically my peers in my specific field. So I enjoyed that very much, and little by little, I was listening to podcasts, and one day I had this epiphany, and I thought, man, I should start my own podcast. And I was in the middle of doing my research then. That was 2018. So you see, the transition started 2-3 years ago now, but it wasn't something negative that prompted me to do that. It was rather something, I just follow what you like doing, and I liked both research and communication, but I found more opportunities in this field right now. I'm still finishing some papers, so I'm definitely in between right now, between being a researcher and hopefully a full-time science communicator.
Got it. So I think since you said one of your fields is the intersection of culture and computer science, and also when you're talking about scientific communication, you mentioned the fact that you're a musician and music plays a integral role in shaping a culture. How do you think that's shaped your perspective as a researcher? Like doing all this music and getting trained as a classical musician, how that helped you build a more like nuanced perspective on your research field?
That is such a beautiful question. So how my background in music influenced my approach to doing science or the research subject?
Yeah, more often like your scientific lens, what I mean to say. It's more like your
Haha,
research again.
yeah. The easy place to start giving you an answer is that my research topic from the get-go had to do with music. So the connection was obvious. And my job from day one, my first contract, was about digitizing old sound recordings on magnetic tape. So music was there every day. How it informed, I never thought about it. I don't know if there's, I don't know.
Like maybe when you're like interviewing people or like something like that. Oh, when you're maybe analyzing culture, you know what I mean?
Yeah, if it informs my approach to doing these things, I think it's pretty much unconscious. But specifically in terms of like a method or a conscious approach to an interview, no, I wouldn't know something that I mutuated from music specifically. But it's a very good question. I know that I'll keep thinking about it and I'll come up with a beautiful answer tomorrow.
Yeah, it's always fascinating. It's just like a question that I randomly had because sometimes like people have these like very interesting perspectives that it almost influences their work, or maybe like specific people in that field. It was interesting asking you that, but I'd like to move on to a more like fundamental question, right? So right now, when you think about computers and STEM, it's just very like hard-nosed field with competitiveness and people rat race startups, and it's very
Yeah.
fast-paced, right? What do you think the role that humanities play in this fast-paced system?
It's a very beautiful question. I strongly believe that somehow technology and economic interests should not lead the game. It should be about people and not about the latest technology. Technology should serve the human community the best it can and not give us that feeling, which I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. There's a new product, the latest thing, and we need to keep up. And there's a sort of anxiety in keeping up with this rapidly evolving fields of mobile communication, or if you're a podcast producer, and even in research, things change all the time. And this creates this feeling of anxiety, needing to reinvent yourself, lifelong learning, develop new skills, and just keep up with the technology. I believe that the humanities, or part of the role that the humanities have, is that of being an intellectual, safe terrain from which we should keep drawing directions on where to go, the ethical aspects of what we're doing. And that requires a little bit more time. The humanities move slower than engineering, for example. That is a problem because the world now is tuned into that speed of technology and engineering.
Uh, that's a very interesting response that, humanities is very slow, whereas like STEM and engineering are like super fast paced. Because you hear the stories about like like the conflicts between like academics and like entrepreneurs that, researchers want a lot of time to research stuff, but entrepreneurs want to get it like quick, and they're more open to break
Yeah.
things than researchers. Do you think like anything like did you have any experience or like anywhere where like you had that like conflict with like you wanted to do something that took a lot of time, but people were asking you to like hurry up or maybe get the results faster?
So, sure thing, I have, but not really because in any of the projects I've been part, I have partnered with someone in the industry that was putting pressure on getting the results. It's in general because I just said the world is tuned into that type of speed, results and numbers, that it's the research funding system that reflects that. And when you apply for any project that includes the field of the humanities, you're expected to do something that is disruptive and very innovative, like in 2 years' time or so. Always. When that project is over, you have to apply for another funding, another grant for another 2 years or 3 years. I mean, the life cycle of projects is short. Even when it's 5 years, it's short compared to what science used to be, which, it didn't coincide with the research projects that have a beginning, have a physiological time, and that is also not always efficient in the middle with all the things that can go wrong. See COVID, for example, or the things you need to adjust along the way, and the final result, the delivery, the final output that should be something that solves some major societal problem or environmental problem. I think that there's an unreasonable expectation and a pressure on researchers to deliver this kind of work, where I can tell you that the more I have worked in academia, and a couple of years in between my grants, I have not received income. So I was between grants. I just kept working 100% or 500%. And I enjoyed those times because I was more free. I was not serving any master in a way. And after a decade of working with sound preservation, and specifically, this is my expertise, I more and more came to realize that to really advance the knowledge, I only know what the next step is. I have an idea for an experiment. I collaborate with chemists, for example. Let's check how tapes degrade in this condition. That's one experiment. And you draw a lot of information out of that experiment, which will give you the idea to do another experiment after that. But it's baby steps. We know, everybody knows science progresses in baby steps, but what we are asked to do as researchers is always submit this research grants proposal that will change the world. That's an unreasonable expectation and has to do with the time expectation that you mentioned in your question. Results, 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 and big ones.
One of the facts that you brought up in while talking about this conflict is that the idea that in research you have a lot of autonomy where you can do you're serving no master technically, but since you're switching to a career of scientific publication or journalism, sometimes there are implicated biases, there are higher ups, there is like a structure, right? How do you think you're going to preserve your perspective even in that environment?
I like to believe that in this field, your original view is valued. This is a field where there will always be uncomfortable things to say. So I see being a communicator and a journalist like two slightly different things. as a communicator, I'm just trying to be the channel for a message. So I want to do my research and be faithful to the person that is the source of the message. That's more like being a channel. As a journalist, I do write opinion pieces, or today you're listening to some of my personal opinions. And I believe that while it takes a little bit of courage to express opinions that are critical sometimes, but I don't believe controversial, just critical opinions on reality, and that I'm very open to see attacked, to see argued against, right? Maybe not today in this conversation, but that's the spirit, you know, it's not pontificating. This is my honest take on reality. So I believe that in journalism, this original view based on experience, because I've been a researcher for 10 years. So yeah, that's how I plan to stay, to not lose that freedom. Also because I am not now with 2 feet in research. I'm just on the side. I do science, communication. I still talk about research. It's a field I love. And in a way, this is a privileged position to talk about research, because I'm not applying for a grant next year again. I'm out of the game in May. I don't think I will, never say never. But it's a privileged position from which I think I can express some of these opinions. So that's the plan.
That's interesting, and I look forward. I think before I would like to ask you about your work in sound preservation. I would like to, like, on a casual note, know what topics would you want to explore when you're a scientific journalist?
Well, I'm very interested always in technology and society. So how this cool, exciting technology impacts people, how they use it. And in particular, I'm very passionate about the fields of cybersecurity, very much. Blockchain is something I like to keep my eyes on. The experts I spoke, not that I understand a lot about it, I keep trying, but experts reassure me that probably non-experts just cannot understand blockchain in depth. But they also say quite convincingly that it's the next big thing, so something to keep our eyes on, blockchain, not just for cryptocurrency, but other types of services. And wireless networks, anything that enables communication between people, I think. I could go on, but these are a few.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting to know. And now I would like to take a slight diversion and ask you, could you elaborate on your work with sound preservation, and what was your research like in sound preservation?
Sure. So we have a wealth of documents, sounds recorded on tape, for example, which was my expertise, but other types of audio carriers, from wax cylinders to shellac discs to CDs, actually, because they degrade too. All of audio carriers degrade over time. The life expectancy of audio carriers is incomparable to that of other cultural heritage materials like sculptures, you know, made in stone, or buildings, even paintings. Maybe paper is the one that comes closest to the physical chemical instability of audio and visual carriers. So they degrade in the matter of decades. And the only way to preserve the content of these carriers, which is the sound recordings we value so much, is that of extracting this content in the process that is commonly known as digitization. Unless, of course, you're trying to save the content of a CD, which is already a digital carrier, so you just remediate, you change medium. And so how does computer science step in, or what skills are needed to operate this digitization? Well, you need historical equipment, the reel-to-reel tape recorders, and the people and the knowledge who are able to operate this obsolete equipment. And while the procedure of content transfer, content extraction is so delicate, After you are done with that, you get a variety of digital data. The audio, you want to preserve also information on the carrier, the box it came in, the attachments, the text that was on the box, etc. So you have to store all this different information in a digital format in a way that is safe for long-term preservation in the digital domain, but also easy to retrieve, which is a problem that pertains computer science 100%, metadata, information retrieval systems. And then the cool thing is that when you have this wealth of digital data, you can start running some AI algorithms and start learning more about patterns of how this archive, or hopefully more archives, if you have the data combined, behaved over time, what happens. So it helps you plan future preservation projects better. I did skip, though, an important part that comes just before digitization, which is when you take a tape in your hands, you need to somehow evaluate its state of preservation, how it's been degrading. That was all part of my PhD dissertation, by the way. And that's when I started collaborating with chemists, because I said, look, I'm an expert in music, audio, and computer science. But the tape is made of polyester most of the times, and it's degrading here in my hands. Is there anything I can do? How can I optimize it for signal extraction? And that's how I connected with some chemists, both in Italy and in Portugal. And we have done great work. We published a lot doing that type of experiments on how tapes age, and some age simulations examples, and how to revert some symptoms of degradation of tapes. So it's actually a huge field with many different competences needed. Too bad that it's an underfunded field that is a little bit in academia and for the most part outside academia, and that also many people think it's a solved problem. It's really, really hard today to get some funding to save an archive, because during the late 90s until 2008-10, there has been a sort of rush to digitization. And, you know, audio is this minor field. It's always underrepresented, even in multimedia conferences where I have been, or conferences in the digital humanities. It's 90% text processing. Audio, and then video, because film is big. We like to see historical video recordings. And audio is this niche that I love so much, and where it would be my joy to keep working. But so my work has touched on all these different fields, from dealing with the tapes per se, collaborating with the chemists, defining a protocol methodologically with even philosophical principles, and then digital philology was part of my work. And then dealing with the digital data, setting up this database for long-term preservation and enable it so that you can go and fetch the information, because you want to use all this wealth of data, of course. You don't want to just keep it locked up. You want to use the audio, the digitized audio, and that's where my work kind of stopped. But there's another field that starts, that is all the applications for final users, has to do with digital libraries and audio restoration. If you want to release a new commercial edition of some of these old recordings, or do a scholarly study with recordings of, I digitized both music and speech. There's old people that were old when they were recorded, and they were recorded 40, 50 years ago. So it's really voices from the past. This is what makes me so passionate about it. I hope I answered your question.
No, it's really interesting because I've never heard so much like somebody talk this passionately about sound. Like it's really good because I am like a film buff, and I think like preserving like film and sound are like super important. Like it's a way to like you're trying to encapsulate history. You know what I mean? Like you're trying to like encapsulate these historical moments, and you're trying to preserve it for like future generations to have. So that was really like it's so enthusiastic to hear your response on this.
Yeah, We take it for granted sometimes because nowadays we just take recordings for granted. Look at us, we're recording now. The television, radio, it's just common. WhatsApp voice message, it's recorded. Someone else anywhere can listen to it. So we definitely fail to see how these things are, number one, special, and that the historical recordings that are degrading are so valuable because they are the sounds of the past, which actually only date back maximum 150 years ago. But this type of recording and playback technology for sound became really, really widespread, I would say, after World War II. Like when you got your recorder at home. When I was little, so early 80s, I would walk around the house with a little recorder. I do have some recordings of myself as a 3-4 years old. And imagine, I don't have that for my mother. And I don't have that for my grandmother. We have less and less pictures also going back. They were black and white. So there is a point in time where looking back, things fade out. And it all disappears into a big, gray space. What would we give to have the sounds, or the speech? Can you imagine? How did Romans talk? How did Native Americans of this tribe or that tribe talk? We would give anything to know. And now we have sound recording, and we should value the ones we have that are already degrading. We produce so much today that hardly everything will disappear. So we're kind of safe. I don't know who will decide what stays and what will stay, but something will stay. But these old recordings that we have, not at the Library of Congress, not in the big institutions, but the small archives or the personal archives for researchers or family archives, those are so precious. So that's why I talk about it so passionately. When you sit in the lab and you play an old tape, I always considered it a huge privilege to listen to that sounds, like I'm the first archaeologist walking into an Egyptian tomb, and I'm the first one to see what's inside after a couple of millennia. I always felt, kind of goosebumps to listen to these voices from the past. So yeah,
I think one
I'm
of the
passionate.
points that you touched up that I felt like is more unique to me, and I feel like I learned something, is the idea of like personal archives. Because when we think about like preserving sound, we usually think like, oh, the Congress, oh, these big political speeches, oh, movies, music, and all that. You never think about this intimate moments that you recorded, and it's almost like it's really like awesome in a way to like hear this from you. And also like what I'm getting at is that like from listening to your perspective is that sound is almost the purest form of recording history. Like, books and all these can have editors, but sound is way it's like raw and pure. Do you like believe in that?
Well, yes and no. I could say yes if I felt particularly inspired and poetic right now. But no, it doesn't. Then you would have to define pure. I don't know. When you talk about documenting the past, you want to have data available and information. So the more complete, the better. And that would have to be multimedia. That would have to be pictures, still images, and moving pictures. And that would have to be documents, like really all of it. I don't believe that it's the purest. I do believe that it has a very strong evocative power. When you watch a still image and then you add sound to it, it comes to life. Yes. So in this regard, it's powerful, but that it is the purest, I wouldn't say.
That's interesting. And yeah, I think that was like what I was asking. And it's also like it's interesting to hear your answer about whether it's a purist or not. And yeah. So I think one of the biggest themes of this podcast is trying to understand the tomorrow, the future. So according to you, how do you see the relationship between technology and society in the next 10, 20 odd years? Like, how do you see as somebody who is into academia in that specific field?
Yes, so I try to stay optimistic, but I know that it won't be a picnic in a way. Why? Because I believe that history teaches us that we have not always made the best choices and the best use in our own interest of the technology that was available, but whatever the situation was, humanity stumbles forward, you know. So there are many red flags that suggest that we should really keep an eye on things like, one example, regulating artificial intelligence, self-driving cars. We have not solved the issue of who to drive over, who to kill, this person, that one, or the passenger on the car. We have not solved that, which has to do with, of course, machine ethics, etc. So when 6G is there and we have these self-driving cars, what will happen? The market will want to make those available to people as soon as possible because they need to sell these new things. It's a novelty. So I believe that we will always be one step ahead of ourselves, and we will first do things, hurt ourselves, and then have a big conversation on how to regulate that and prevent that from happening again. And I made the example of self-driving cars, but I am very much afraid that this will happen also in this. I apologize, English is not even my second language. I struggle sometimes to get it right the first time. The fact that we're being monitored so much, and that as we progress, that only seems to be happening more and more. Actually, it will when we have more wearable devices, where our house becomes smarter. Well, we will deliver and share more data about ourselves that we even do now on Facebook and WhatsApp and these social media platforms that we choose to be on. This is a future that looks to me like it's a future we cannot escape. 6G will be there with all its services, and my house will be smart at some point, just because either I will rent and it will be like that, or I will want to build a new house, and this is just how houses will come. And so you cannot escape this future, and I have some reservations on these things. So sometimes I am not just skeptical, but a little bit weary, like I'm going towards this future with my brakes on. But on the other hand, you see, I don't have one position, optimistic or not. I just gave you the negatives one, but I also see the potential of technology, like see medicine. Are you kidding me? It's probably the most underrated science today, what it does for us, that it keeps you alive, that it fixes you when you're broken in extreme ways, and artificial organs. That is amazing. We are not old enough to remember how life could be when your life expectancy was my age tomorrow, or whatever your life expectancy could be, that you could just die any moment throughout your life for some disease that was not curable. So medicine, yay, big time. Advancements in medicine, awesome. I believe that our life expectancy will get even longer, and I look forward to more of that. I wish I could be that generation that already lives to 150. So, okay, enough for medicine, but let me tell you, that is, I believe, the most underrated science today for its achievements. But at the same time, communication technology, I enjoy this very much. I didn't grow up with these types of things. I had my first cell phone when I was, I believe, 16, 17, and that was early. So early that I didn't know who to talk to, because all my friends didn't have a cell phone then. And because my father was a little bit of a geek, I was always among the first to have an email account or a Skype account back then. And I didn't know what to do with these things because I didn't know who to write to, who to talk to. And now that we are having this conversation, for example, I have my smartphone always when I'm constantly connected, and I feel connected with people I care for and my friends. Like tomorrow is my birthday, and I planned to talk to a lot of my friends all across the world, from New Zealand to California, you know. That is amazing, and I believe that as we find new creative ways to leverage the power, the potential of these tools, that it will change society. It will redefine how we, well, define, sorry, the same word twice, our inner circle of people, your dear ones and your daily connections and the experts you can connect with. I don't know, everything. I'm not a visionary that way. I don't always have an intuition about potential future uses of technologies, but I have the intuition that there is potential. So I'll just say that communication technology, amazing. Telepresence, who knows, digital twins sending smells over the internet, holograms, that's super amazing. So I hope to live a long life just because I get to see some of that, and it will be good. So I hope that in a very long time, I'm sorry, I gave you some of the negatives, but also some of the positives that should make us excited.
Yeah, it is. We are heading to interesting times, as I believe, good or bad. It is definitely like an interesting time to live in history. Before I wrap this interview up, I would like to ask you a more like a chill out question, a more casual question, which is like, so you have worked in academia in both Europe and the States in America. What do you find is the biggest difference with how like researchers approach their work in Europe versus how they approach their work in America?
Okay, so first of all, I wouldn't generalize Europe. I have worked in Italy and in Belgium. I know researchers all over Europe, but I have worked in Italy and in Belgium, and I have only worked in New York, in the United States. Your specific question was the main difference on the approach of researchers, and I would actually say that there is very little difference there, because researchers by definition are these people who are curious and passionate about something. So on both sides of the pond, they approach their job in all seriousness, with great dedication and passion. What changes is the difficulties that they face due to how the system is structured, the institution is structured, research funding or bureaucracy even.
That's
Yeah,
interesting to
so
know how
yeah.
there's a systematic difference between both these fields. Dr. Prasad, it's a pleasure to have this conversation with you about a variety of topics ranging from society to sound to technology. And I hope we get to have a chat later, like when you become a scientific journalist.
Well, thank you so much. You are a wonderful interviewer, and I commend you for taking some of your time to also be doing interviews like this to me today and to the other guests. Good for you. Thank you very, very much for having me on.
It was a pleasure having you. Hope you have a good night ahead. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.